Okay, we're back. Hi! Hello, everyone. So, this was requested about a month ago, and I apologize. I don't remember who it was, but they said there was Infographics had a thing about, I don't know, the U.S. and powers, I don't know. But this was how the United States became the most powerful country in the world. And then there was another one about the rise of the U.S. from 1776 to 1900. But this one is 29 minutes, so it'll be broken into two. I'm actually doing this below the camera, so I'm raising it up so you can see I was doing it. Two videos, around 15 minutes. So, let's get into it.
Getting to the 20th century for the United States of America took 2 wars with Great Britain, a civil war that killed over 1 million Americans, 2 presidential assassinations, and a whole lot of chaos. Surely history will calm down now, right? 1900s. As 1901 dawned, the McKinley administration was beginning its second term. The pro-business imperialist Republican president had picked progressive New York Governor Theodore Roosevelt as his vice president, mostly to get him out of the way for the party bosses in New York. After all, the vice president doesn't actually have any power. So all McKinley had to do to keep him neutralized was stay alive. That shouldn't be a problem, right? Well, Leon Czolgosz had entered the chat. The radical anarchist ambushed McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo and shot him. McKinley survived the initial assassination, but just like President Garfield, that didn't mean he was out of the woods. His condition seemed to be improving, but 8 days after the shooting, he succumbed to an infection. This was the 3rd presidential assassination in 50 years, and more security for the president became a hot topic. Czolgosz was sentenced to death by...
All right. There's a really great story about, on those pictures, the middle one was James Garfield. And I think I might have told the story before, but there's a great story about after Garfield's assassination. What was his name? Chester A. Arthur gets notified that he's going to be the president. He was really worried. Well, he was on this train. This has nothing to do with this, but he was on there, and so I just say it. He was on this train, and he was the only one. It was the presidential car, and they were going down to, or maybe they were going up to Buffalo, or down to what? I don't remember. They were going some. Maybe they were going to Ohio. I think that's where Garfield was from. Regardlessly, I don't know, whatever the word was. He's on this presidential train all by himself, and he's just crying because his, not really a friend, he wasn't really friends with Garfield, but kind of in a way this new friendship, and now this guy's dead, and now he is the leader of this country. And so he's just overwhelmed. This was not what he had signed up for. And the train makes a stop, and Ulysses S. Grant walks in. Now, Garfield was president number 20. Grant was 18. Rutherford B. Hayes was 19. Garfield was 20. He was assassinated, so Chester A. Arthur's 21. So Grant gets on there, enters, closes the door, sees Arthur. Grant takes his hat off, kind of nods, walks down the aisle, and sits in the chair on the opposite side of the aisle that Arthur's sitting in. Of all the seats, he picks the one seat. It's like him and an empty row, and then an aisle, and now Grant's sitting in that seat. And Arthur was trying to keep it together. He wasn't saying anything. Grant didn't say anything. And the rest of the ride was basically Arthur silently whimpering. Ride gets over. Grant stands up, puts his hand on Chester A. Arthur's shoulder and says, "I know what it's like to lose a friend. I lost a friend as well." Obviously referring to Lincoln. He then walks up to the door, stops, turns, and looks back. So, like, this is the door. Instead of facing the door, he's sideways, and he looks down at Arthur. And he just stands there and waits. And Chester A. Arthur gets up because he realizes Grant's not leaving. Grant is not opening up this door until Arthur's ready. And it is a complete sign of respect that Grant is refusing to exit this presidential car first, because he's not the president. Chester A. Arthur's the president. So he stands there and waits, and Arthur comes walking up, and Grant looks at him, and I believe fixes his tie or fixes his coat, kind of brushes him off. And then, "Are you ready?" And Arthur nods. He opens the door. Arthur walks through, and Grant waits. And then walks through. Gives him his moment. And then walks through. Grant never told anyone about this moment. The only reason why we know is Chester A. Arthur, after his presidency, admitted it to a bunch of hunting buddies. And he said it was one of the nicest, kindest things. And in that moment, Grant was one of the warmest people ever. And the fact that Grant never said anything and eventually died, Grant never said anything about it to anyone, not even his wife. He kept that. That was a president going through an issue. He wasn't about to spoil or, can you believe he was crying on the nothing. That's a solid guy in that moment, and if you're going through it in that moment, that's somebody you would want with you. I apologize for that long-winded story, but I think it's one of those things that should be told, because it does show, yes, the kindness of, another president, but it also shows that we all have moments of weakness, and there's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is when you're around someone who doesn't respect that, and then they blab about it like, this guy was crying like a little girl. Like, come on, man. Like, that's just a dick move. I apologize. Back to the video.
Sentenced to death by electric chair, and Theodore Roosevelt was headed for the White House, and he would come to define the decade. Roosevelt was pro-business, but also pro-regulation, and he wanted to make sure the megacorps that were starting to form didn't grow out of control. He passed business reforms that were popular with his progressive base, but it didn't stop growth. This was the era when famous corporations like U.S. Steel, the Ford Motor Company, and Harley-Davidson were formed. The first World Series was played, and Roosevelt's international policy continued with McKinley's legacy of expansion. The U.S. acquired the Panama Canal Zone, Oklahoma became a state, and Roosevelt was seen as a wildly successful president. The former outcast was overwhelmingly re-elected, but there would come to be some rough waters ahead. Racial equality and women's suffrage were both major topics, with new groups forming to advocate for their rights. America suffered two huge disasters in a 2-year period, with a massive earthquake in San Francisco and a devastating coal mine explosion in West Virginia. The FBI and Department of Commerce and Labor were both founded under Roosevelt. Diplomatic relations with Japan were opened, and Roosevelt's second term was a big success, enough for his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, to easily win the 1908 election. Taft was a laid-back man who mostly continued with Roosevelt's policies and leveraged America's wealth overseas as opposed to its military force. The NAACP was formed under his tenure, but he would soon hit some major stumbling blocks because his mentor wasn't done just yet. 1910s. Taft's presidency was dominated by economic and labor affairs. More reforms were passed, and the Supreme Court broke up the massive Standard Oil Corporation in 1911. That same year, the horrible Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in New York killed 146 garment workers, bringing new attention to the plight of the working class. New Mexico and Arizona were admitted as states, the Girl Scouts were founded, and the sinking of the Titanic, taking over 2,000 passengers with it, shocked the world. But this next election was going to be the craziest yet. Taft was largely seen as respectable but ineffectual, and had lost much of his support.
Again? Well, I guess it seems awful fast to have an ad. Okay, though. All right, come on. Come on. Come on. There you go. Sorry about that. Oh.
Effectual, and had lost much of his support from the party. Roosevelt founded his own Bull Moose Party, while the Democrats nominated the little-known New Jersey governor Woodrow Wilson, who had been a college president only 2 years before. Roosevelt even survived an assassination attempt on the campaign trail, but the split vote made it easy for Wilson to win the election, and the Democrats returned to the presidency for only the third time since the Civil War. And he would be a big change in direction. Under Wilson, the income tax and direct election of the U.S. senators was established. The Federal Trade Commission was formed, the first assembly line was created by Henry Ford, and movies became much more popular, with the introduction of the racist Southern revisionist film, The Birth of a Nation. But Wilson
screened that in the White House because the director was his friend. Wilson.
His term would be dominated by foreign affairs as World War I broke out in Europe, soon pulling the entire continent in. Wilson was more isolationist than his predecessors and vowed to avoid a major war, even when 128 Americans were killed in the German sinking of the British ship RMS Lusitania. Wilson stayed fast, even campaigning for re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." He won a narrow victory over Charles Hughes in the same election where the first woman, Jeannette Rankin, was elected to Congress. But his campaign promise wasn't to be. Not long after his election victory, the Zimmerman telegram was intercepted. This was a message where the German Empire promised to help Mexico reclaim lost territory if they assisted them against the Americans. That was enough, and the U.S. entered World War I in 1917. It would be the most brutal war in the country's history yet, with a massive draft sending over 2 million men abroad to fight. Over 100,000 ultimately died, and things were rough on the home front as well. The Espionage and Sedition Acts sent many anti-war activists to prison, and Wilson cracked down on the communist movement in what would become the first Red Scare. If you're thinking all this calls for a stiff drink, think again! Prohibition was sweeping the nation, with alcohol banned in 29 states. 1918 would see the end of the war, but not the end of chaos. Republicans won back Congress right before the war ended, as change was in the air. Countless people celebrated the end of the war, right before the Spanish flu pandemic hit the U.S. and killed over 500,000 Americans. Shortly after signing the Treaty of Versailles and while planning the founding of the League of Nations, Wilson was felled by a major stroke that incapacitated him. But he didn't leave office. Rather, his wife Edith essentially ran his affairs for the rest of his presidency, leading many people to consider her the unofficial first female president. But it didn't go so well. Congress rejected both the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, although they did pass an amendment banning alcohol nationwide as the age of prohibition began. Baseball fans had reason to drink as the World Series was marred by cheating in the Black Sox scandal. The 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote was finally passed, and the economy went through another collapse just in time for an election, which led to the election of Republican Warren G. Harding. The 1920s would start off slow but go out with an economic bang. 1920s. Warren G. Harding was a little-known Ohio senator when he won the presidency, and he didn't seem to want to be a transformative president. He quietly signed separate treaties with the aggressors in World War I and appointed many of his allies and friends to powerful positions. He was seen as an extremely pro-business president, maybe too pro-business. He seemed uninterested in race issues, as a horrible race riot targeting an affluent black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma didn't gather much of a response. He was too busy engaging in blatant acts of patronage, plotting to sell off U.S. assets to private oil companies, but he wouldn't be held accountable for it. Harding suddenly died in 1923 of a heart attack, just as the scandal was being exposed. Several of his cabinet officials went to prison in the aftermath, and his administration, already seen as hostile to labor interests, was seriously tarnished. He was replaced by his vice president Calvin Coolidge, a mild-mannered Massachusetts governor nicknamed Silent Cal. He earned praise for his support of racial equality, including
Silent Cal. I gotta say this. Great nickname. This is a story. He was at a party, and obviously Silent Cal, you don't get that nickname because you talk a lot. He didn't need to talk. He listened a lot. He probably judged, but he didn't talk a lot. So the party host was a friend of his and knew that. And so he invited the party host had invited this woman. She was one of those went around, just a butterfly, talked to everyone, just and everyone loved communicating with her. She could have been attractive. I don't know. So that host made a bet with her and then set her next to Calvin Coolidge. And the bet was, you can get him, that the host said to her, I bet you cannot get him to say more than 3 words. Or no, maybe it was 2 words. 2 words or 3 words. You cannot get a conversation with this guy. You can't get him to say more than 2 or 3 words to you for the night. And she goes, I'll take that bet. So she sat down next to him and she said, I made a bet tonight that I can get you to say more than 2 or 3 words. And he, whatever he was doing, eating or whatever, didn't even look up at her. He just kind of went like this. She said all that and he went, you lose, and went right back to whatever he was like eating or whatever. She lost the bet. Those were the only words that he said to her all night. He just completely disregarded her as a human being and did not acknowledge a single thing. That was one of the stories in that book that I enjoyed. Calvin Coolidge, not a really interesting guy in terms of doing a whole lot. He was very... He's just one of those people, like, good guy, didn't do a whole lot. But yeah, he didn't talk a whole lot either. Not like me, apparently.
Granting citizenship to Native Americans, but he strictly regulated immigration. Under him, J. Edgar Hoover became director of the Bureau of Investigation, kicking off a decades-long career. Coolidge was easily...
Seriously? We're 6 minutes in and get ads every 2 minutes? Come on, man. I don't mind paying, that you
Coolidge
get paid,
was
but...
easily elected to a full term, and his second term was largely calm. Charles Lindbergh successfully flew across the Atlantic. The first talkie motion picture was released, and the first Disney cartoon came out. But was there a ticking time bomb in the works? Coolidge's tenure was calm and he was well liked, but his hands-off approach to economic affairs meant that banks were making risky investments. When it came time for the next election, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover won an easy victory over the first Catholic nominee, Al Smith. Hoover's vice president, Charles Curtis, was a Native American conservative and the first person of color ever elected to a federal executive role. But less than a year into his presidency, a massive stock market collapse hit. Countless people lost everything. Banks collapsed and took people's life savings with them. And Hoover was seen as caught flat-footed by the whole thing. Democrats took back the country.
He wasn't. The entire time he was in Calvin Coolidge's office, for like 18 months, Coolidge was making cuts to the budget and decrease the federal, not the budget, I'm sorry, the debt. Decrease the debt a lot, but he just kept cutting and cutting and cutting. And Hoover said, I couldn't find my Hoover book to flash at you. Sorry. Nope, can't see it. So Hoover said, you got to loosen up on these cuts. Don't cut as much. You got to leave a little meat on the bone for other people, because when you're cutting the budgets on things to lower the debt, you're also risking cutting certain areas where people are going to lose their jobs. And that started to trickle down. And Hoover told him, you couldn't do it. Please don't do this. Please don't do this. He did it. Calvin Coolidge stopped listening to Hoover because he took Hoover as a political rival, which he wasn't. They're both Republicans, but he took him as a guy who was going to run for president and was more interested in that than being in his cabinet. Hoover's downfall was as soon as he got into the presidency, he continued with some of those cuts, and he didn't rein it back like according to the book, like he really wanted to. And eventually, when he started to see the issues, it was too late. Once you, according to this, once you start to see, oh, look, we're going downhill, you're actually here. It's like when the sun rises, when you see the sun, it's actually 8 minutes, like 8 minutes and 20 seconds behind what you're seeing. So where you're seeing it, it's actually 8 minutes and 20 seconds higher than what it is. It's not a whole lot, but light takes 8 minutes to get from the sun to the earth for us to see. Well, take that into account for Hoover. When he thought we were here, we're actually here. It was too late. I apologize for all the stopping, but I'm a talky boy sometimes.
Congress by massive margins in 1930, and the first half of Hoover's presidency ended with him reeling. America was about to enter its most consequential decade in a long time, 1930s. Herbert Hoover tried to dig the U.S. out of the Great Depression, but many of his attempts to help the economy, like vetoing a bonus for World War I soldiers, were deeply unpopular. Many Americans were desperate for help, struggling to find food for their family. This led to massive migration to cheaper areas of the country, as well as a boost in the popularity of socialism. Hoover seemed like a dead man walking electorally, and for the second time in the 20th century, America looked to a Roosevelt. The young progressive governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had survived a bout with polio and successfully hid his disability on the campaign trail, and was on his way to winning a massive electoral victory. But he almost didn't make it to the White House. Not long after his victory, a far-left gunman who thought Roosevelt was a moderate fired at him and killed the mayor of Chicago. That gave Roosevelt even more popular support when he took office, and he had big plans. With over 25% of Americans unemployed, he used his first 100 days to establish the New Deal, a massive social safety net that helped America recover from the Great Depression. Dozens of new government programs were established, the banks were reformed, and Social Security was introduced. He named the first female cabinet official, Frances Perkins, and Prohibition was repealed, saving the government a ton of money on enforcement and serving as a relief to many, no doubt. When the Supreme Court challenged many of his policies, Roosevelt threatened to appoint extra judges to overrule them. This failed, as even his allies balked at this new power grab, but several judges agreed to resign and give him a bigger say over the court. It was a busy time, and Roosevelt was seen as a massive success.
By the way, a lot of the policies that FDR put into place were the same policies that he was bashing Herbert Hoover for. But we were in such a decline, you just throw things at the wall and see what sticks, and that's kind of what he was doing. And when he started coming up with his own things, they would work, just like Hoover would come up with something, and it would work. Like we were in a free fall, and then it would steady off and do this, and then it would peak. But Hoover wasn't acting fast enough to catch that when it would start to go from the decline. Oh, it's holding. It's going up a little bit. Okay, now it's starting to go down a little bit. And Hoover would, well, let's see if it balances out. Well, okay, now he's playing catch up, and he throws something else. Well, now it's down here, and it's going down again. He was acting too late. FDR, on the other hand, kept throwing shit at the wall. And it was doing the same thing. It was going, okay, like that. The war is what turned everything around. War production shot up. That was how the economy got saved. It wasn't really his policies, unfortunately.
But trouble was brewing. The first few years of Roosevelt's tenure were dominated by the battle to fix the economy, but abroad things were changing fast. The Japanese Empire was waging a brutal war of conquest in Asia, and in Europe, the racist populist Adolf Hitler had taken control of Germany. In addition to persecuting the Jews, he was quickly trying to take back territory lost in the First World War. But America wanted to stay out of these conflicts, and Germany even hosted the Olympics during this era, with black American athlete Jesse Owens humiliating Hitler by winning on his turf. Roosevelt would be overwhelmingly re-elected to a second term, with Congress passing several acts designed to keep the U.S. out of a war despite German and Japanese provocations. The Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge would both be completed during this time period. Superman would make his comic book debut, and the Hatch Act was introduced to tackle political corruption. But everyone knew what was coming. In 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland and World War II was officially on. Most of America's close allies in Europe were either conquered by the Nazis or battling against them, so Roosevelt made the controversial decision to run for a third term. He instituted the first peacetime draft, which his opponent Wendell Willkie supported, and cruised to another overwhelming victory. The 1940s would once again be defined by war. 1940s. As 1941 began, Roosevelt began supplying his allies with materials to help them fight the war while staying out of it directly. In Europe, Hitler seemed to be going mad by invading Russia, his former ally, and then Japan one-upped him in madness by attacking the U.S. military base at Pearl.
Like an ad every 2.5 minutes? It's a little ridiculous. I'm all for you getting money, but Jesus.
U.S. military base at Pearl Harbor. To no surprise, this got the U.S. into the war immediately, and then they joined the European theater when Germany declared war. Soon the U.S. turned its entire industrial production toward the war, and domestically there were big changes as well. The draft ramped up and a total of 16 million Americans went off to war. The Japanese-American population was persecuted and sent to internment camps, and basic products like sugar and gasoline were rationed. But the U.S. entry into the war would have a big impact. The struggling British war effort was boosted by American support, and the Japanese faced serious opposition in the Pacific. As the war ticked on, the Germans were put on their back foot. They lost territory after territory, and the Allied invasion of France in 1944 turned the tide. Roosevelt, still riding high, ran for an unprecedented fourth term over token opposition and won. After Hitler's death in a Berlin bunker and Germany's surrender, the U.S. turned their full attention to a war in the Pacific. Now it was time to win the peace. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin met to carve up the post-war world at Yalta. But Roosevelt would not live to see the end of the war. He died of a stroke less than a year into his fourth term and was succeeded by his VP Harry Truman. Truman would turn his full attention to the war in the Pacific, and the war would come to an end with 2 massive bombs detonating over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The nuclear age had begun, and the United Nations would form in the aftermath. Now it was time to deal with the consequences of the conflict on the home front, as the war had led to stiff inflation, and now millions of young men, many of them injured or traumatized, were returning. Truman did a good job with overseeing the recovery of Europe, and he desegregated the armed forces, but America seemed ready for a change. Was Governor Thomas Dewey really the favorite in 1948? It turns out, no. The election was seen as such a sure thing that papers printed Dewey defeats Truman headlines, which made one heck of a photo op for the victorious President Truman. But
so there's a great thing about Truman. I mean, obviously everyone knows him holding the newspaper. Dewey wins, but Truman's second inaugural campaign sent out notices to a bunch of people asking them, President Truman's re-election campaign would love to see you there, blah 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 blah, and you had to fill it out and send it back so that they knew. And Truman received one of these, and instead of like looking at it and saying, what the hell is this all about, he filled it out. If weather permitting, I hope to be there, and then sent that in. And I thought, what a funny thing to do. Like, somebody's going to catch that, oh my gosh, we sent this to the president who's getting reelected, and he filled it out and sent it back. That's funny.
as the 1940s ended, good news like Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball were overshadowed by the growing presence of communism. The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, becoming the second nuclear nation. China fell to the communists, and the Cold War was on. What lay ahead in the 1950s? 1950s. The final days of the Truman presidency would be dominated by fear over communism. Senator Joseph McCarthy began a crusade to root out communists in America, targeting many prominent Hollywood figures. When a civil war broke out in Korea between communists and Western-aligned military figures, the U.S. got involved and helped to lock down a two-state system that exists to this day. Truman barely survived an assassination attempt by two radical Puerto Rican independence activists, and the 22nd Amendment limited the president to 2 terms, no more Roosevelts. But it was clear the country was ready for a change. In 1952, the charismatic war hero General Dwight D. Eisenhower followed in the footsteps of Ulysses S. Grant, picking the staunch anti-communist Richard Nixon as his VP. He easily won over Adlai Stevenson and began an era of prosperity for the country. This was...
People don't talk about Eisenhower as much, you know, in terms of when you think of the presidents. Eisenhower was, I think, is vastly underrated. And a lot of people talk about him being a good president. I think he was really good. He was a really good president. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just that stoic way that he carried himself. But, man, he strikes me as just a good guy. Minus the fact that when he was the Allied Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, he was having an affair in England. Okay, fine. But when he would come home to see his wife, he would call his wife the assistant that he was having sex with in Europe. But we do have the Eisenhower Interstate because of him, so...
the era known as the baby boom. As post-Depression and World War II birth rates skyrocketed, families gathered around the TV as that became the primary form of entertainment, and the fear of communism led to interventions abroad, such as a coup in Iran that would haunt the country for decades. But there was progress as well. The civil rights movement was picking up steam after the war, and the Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court ruling put an end to segregated schools, once the southern states were forced to comply. Other flashpoints, like the murder of young Emmett Till and Rosa Parks' bus protest, would kick off the movement that would build for the next decade.
There's a movie called Till, if you want to know about the story. Brutal story. Yeah, I mean, don't just like, hey, I'm going to pick this up and watch it on a Friday night and maybe I'll laugh. No, you won't. No.
The polio vaccine put an end to a terrifying plague. Disneyland opened, and Elvis Presley began his rise to fame. Eisenhower was easily re-elected in 1956 as the good times rolled, and the first Civil Rights Act of the era was passed in 1957. But international affairs were about to put a stop to the fun and games. The space race kicked off when the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite, the first man-made object in orbit. The Civil War in Vietnam and
at least they're slowing down. Yeah, Eisenhower also, NASA was instituted under him.
War in Vietnam and the Cuban Revolution brought some more communist governments to power, and the U.S. officially completed its growth, with the addition of Alaska and Hawaii as states.
I'm going to go back just a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and call it there, right about there. And I'm going to call this the end of video 1. I apologize for making it so much longer, but I always found if somebody has something to contribute, maybe it's a story or whatever, I always think that's pretty cool. I didn't throw this in for Teddy Roosevelt, but I don't know if anyone knows about it. I'm sure you do. Does anyone know why we call a teddy bear a teddy bear? I don't know if I'm sure I've mentioned this on the channel before. So So Roosevelt was hunting when he was president, I believe, and he was out in like the Badlands area, Wyoming, Montana, and he was having a terrible go. And he had some newspaper people that were with him, and he had scouts with him and stuff. And the scouts woke up early one morning, and they went out to scout the area. They came back. He's in camp cooking breakfast, and they're just like, you got to come on. We found some game. We found some game. He takes his skillet with bacon cooking in it and sticks it off the fire. Gets up, grabs his gun, his hat, and some other stuff, and they jump on the horse and take off. They lead him to this area, down a little hill, I guess, and there was a tree. And they had a baby brown bear or baby black bear. Just a baby. Tied to this tree. Chained or tied. I don't know. Just tied to the tree. And they were like, there you go. We found you some game. And he immediately demanded that the bear be released. And then he scolded them. This is murder. This isn't hunting. Turned around, he left. He went back to the camp, started cooking his bacon. One of the newspaper people, I don't know if they were fast enough to make it there or, to go on that hunt. So when he comes back, they see him empty-handed. So they're like, well, what happened? And he tells the story. Guy writes a story, forwards it to the local station that telegraphs it to, DC or New York or whatever. And from there, the story goes national. Near the area he was hunting, a toy store owner and maybe candy or whatever, this guy takes and takes like a little animal, fills it with stuffing, and makes what would be a replica baby bear. Fills it with stuffing and puts it out to sell. And he calls it Teddy's Bear. Kids buy it up. It eventually loses the apostrophe S and just becomes Teddy Bear. So, any stuffed animal that you see a kid has and they refer to it as a teddy bear, that's the story behind it. It's a teddy bear. It's Teddy's Bear. So, there you go. I'm sure you already knew that, but just another cool little thing to throw out there. So I like to remember gems every now and then. They're just really cool little things that make me laugh. Probably not anyone else. Okay, so I'm going to end this, and we will be back with part 2, which part 2 will be uploaded tomorrow. So you only have to wait a day. So until then, have a good day. Have a good night. Like and subscribe.